Well, good morning, everyone. It's about that time. I am so excited that we are going on a virtual field trip to the Jamestown settlement. I kind of discovered Jamestown settlement just this last summer when I took my family down, and oh, it was lovely. We just so much appreciated. We often have so many gems in our own backyard, and yet they're so still unexplored. So with us today, we have Mark Summers, and we are sure glad that you are here, Mark. Would you just take a moment to introduce yourself?
My name's Mark Summers. I grew up in Virginia. I'm actually at home right now, but I live 30 minutes away from Jamestown, so I'll be going there later today. I just had to drop my kid off, and I figured let's not be late. And I do virtual programs for children and adults, including seniors. I do about 120 of these a year with different subjects. I also work as an historian, which means I help out archaeologists. I write exhibit scripts. I also do public tours outdoors, mostly on Saturdays. So it's a job where you're kind of like a fourth grade teacher and a college professor and an office worker all rolled into one. The good news is when the pandemic happened, we were forced to do things online. By the way, I was very terrible at it 5 years ago. Have had a lot of practice since, and now it's become a regular thing for distance learning. So, for example, yesterday I did a program for students in Nebraska, and the day before that it was students from California, and with you all in Maryland. And then I'll probably this week do about three public tours for whoever comes to the park. So it's a lot of fun. I switch ages, I switch subjects, and I switch modes, but I'm used to doing public speaking. So this is sort of a version of what I did with Smithsonian Associates. It's a travel company, and most of their clientele are senior citizens. And we did this for them as part one of a series. And I also did this very same program for the lifelong learners of Hilton Head, South Carolina. And so, if this is something you end up liking, there are follow-up programs we can always do later. So, what we'll do is we'll have a combination of slides, but also I wanted to use a version that had some video so you could actually see what Jamestown looks like today. And so, we'll do a mixture of that. And what we're only gonna cover today is the first 4 years of Jamestown. You're like, how are you gonna do all this time period? You have just 4 years to talk about. There's a whole lot of Jamestown. So, disclaimer out of the way, or basic story. We learned this phrase when we grew up in Virginia. We're going to use it at the park. We use it on tours. If you haven't heard it yet, you will at some point if you read about Jamestown or you come down here. It's a phrase that says Jamestown represents the first permanent English settlement in North America, or some version of that. Every fourth grader in Virginia has to memorize this and then kind of repeat it. Part of my problem when I work with kids, when you memorize something and you repeat it, when you think fill in the blank instead of essays, is you don't stop and think, what am I actually saying? You see, whoever wrote that was a lawyer, I think. It's very carefully worded. See, we're not actually claiming that Jamestown is the first English colony. We're claiming the first permanent, you see, first successful, because even the word permanent isn't a great word because people think, oh, I'll go there and all the old buildings are still there. Oh, no, no, no. Jamestown no longer has a population. It's simply a park and a museum. It stopped being the capital of Virginia in 1699, similar to the original capital of Maryland was St. Mary's, and it no longer is. Very similar. And it stopped being a town by the 1780s, and the last farmers left 1934. So permanent means in a cultural sense. Things like language, the majority language. We don't have an official language, but the majority language in the United States is English de facto. The legal system of the United States is based on English common law. We inherited that from once being British. And our political system, a little different than theirs, but still the principles that we often fight over in the United States are actually inherited from arguments in Britain. And if you're saying, well, yeah, but we overthrew the British in 1776, we did. And it's the most British thing we ever did. To rebel against the British is actually a British thing to do. What I mean by that is to rebel for rights you already expected. And see, that means we need to look somewhere for that to begin. Now, if you are at one point that you live in Florida or you're from there, you're going to say, well, hey, we have this place called St. Augustine, and people still live there. And it's 55 years before Jamestown, but it's Spanish. Yeah, and then we shouldn't ignore that because 1 out of 5 Americans has some Spanish heritage. It's important, but it didn't shape those things I just talked about. And Native American people. We're going to talk about one group today called the Powhatan. Well, they've been here for thousands of years. We certainly aren't going to ignore them. We're not ignoring that the United States is a diverse country with many ingredients. We're just saying that the political backbone of what becomes the United States comes from having once been English colonies, good, bad, and in between. That then makes Jamestown very important. But if you're originally from a northern state, you say, well, I didn't learn about Jamestown in school. I learned about the Pilgrims who came to Massachusetts. Oh, that's a good way to offend Virginians. Now, I'm very nice about this because my grandmother was from New England, and I like New England. But the Pilgrim story began in 1620, and Jamestown is 13 years older. And so a lot of Virginians, particularly older Virginians, they get kind of upset. And I'll tell you why, if you haven't been in our state very often, we love to be first at everything. It's like a big deal for us to be first. And so that is why people in Virginia used to be very testy about it. Jamestown, Jamestown, Jamestown. So all the different ingredients of the United States are important. My job is just to talk about my state's contribution to the establishment of this country. And again, we're only going to cover the first 4 years. But let me tell you something, those first 4 years are exciting, interesting, devastating, controversial. So, all that out of the way, let's get this show on the road. Now, I sound like a person who loves Jameson a lot, and I do because they've paid me for 14 years. I better like it. When I was a kid growing up in Virginia, it was not my favorite time period. Like, I always liked history since I can remember. I kind of liked the Revolutionary War the best. I was interested in Civil War history because the city I grew up in was involved, and I felt like I could relate to those people. The problem I had with the 1600s is, to me, they all look like guys with poofy pants and lace collars, frowning at me in paintings. The Shakespearean English was very difficult for me when I was young. I got used to it. And now when I go to a Shakespeare play, I start laughing out loud at the jokes because I've spent so many years learning, that version of English. But at the time, you see, that can be a barrier. And we didn't have a lot of great information about Jamestown back in the 1980s and 90s when I was a kid or when you were children. It wasn't that different. We've learned a lot about Jamestown since we've been doing archaeology about it for the last 31 years. And the team I work for has found 5 million artifacts and a whole lot of buildings. I'll show you around. All right, let's go move on here. We're going to cover history. We're going to cover some archaeology. These are my key points I want to go over today. We're going to see what it looks like now in the year 2025. Now, this second one's more for younger audiences, but I'll say for you guys, how do we know what we know? In other words, how do I look at, as an historian, at eyewitness documents like Captain John Smith and try to separate what's likely a true story for what's being exaggerated? And that's a problem in the 1600s, is people didn't try to write as accurately or as scientifically as we would today in the history business. In other words, it was expected you would kind of exaggerate back then. So, how do I deal with that as an historian? Well, I have friends called archaeologists that are finding not only artifacts from more than one culture, but they're finding where buildings used to be. We're finding skeletons. They're doing forensic science. And that's helping to fill in the gaps a little bit. It's not that the people in England were lying to us, is that we didn't understand what they meant. And so many times when we find something, we go, oh, that's what they meant by that phrase. So it's actually pretty cool to do that. And then most importantly, we're going to use all that to tell the story of the English people who came in 1607 and the Native American called the Powhatan that resisted them. See, I talk to people from all over the country. They show up on Saturday, and look, if I have 100 people, 25 are gung ho Jamestown. I don't have to win them over. They already kind of, they know a lot about it. And that's great. And then you'll have people like they're just there, right? Whatever. I try to shoot for the 50 in the middle and to say that Jamestown is not just a story about Virginia, and Jamestown is not just a story about England, and Jamestown's not just a story about the Powhatan, and it's not just a story about the 1600s. What we're really going to be doing right now is, I hope, proving how practical history is. I'm sure someone's told you at some point that's not a practical thing to study. Let me tell you what's practical about history. When you turn on the news, whether you like what you're hearing or you don't like what you're hearing, if you're an historian, you're never surprised. It's kind of already happened before. Everything that we face today is based on what people did in the past. So knowing the past is a good way to understand the present and perhaps sometimes foresee the future. So what I'm saying is, we're actually talking about two groups of people. You could change their names, you could change their locations, you could even change their time periods, but follow me on this. Two groups of people are going to want the same land. They're going to want it at the same time. They don't speak the same language. They don't have the same religion. And they both would have told you that their gods gave them the land. Now, if you're thinking about that, and you say, well, that's kind of happened all over the world, what tends to happen? There's going to be conflict. And so maybe Jamestown is a safer way, 400 years ago, of understanding the world today. And by the way, history makes me less partisan because whenever I see these things that happen, and there are things I agree with and things I disagree with, don't get me wrong. I mean, I have opinions, but I try to share my opinions only based on the evidence that I see. And normally, when you really deep dive into something, you realize it's far more complicated and far less black and white than the 30 seconds on the news, which is why we're taking some time today. All right, now let's get our show on the road. I want to start with the Powhatan people. Now, the first thing I want to share with you is I pronounce that word the way we're used to saying it in Virginia. We don't actually know how that word was pronounced 400 years ago. So if somebody were to say Powhatan or Powhatan, I'm not going to get offended. I'm just saying we grow up saying things locally and we use the phrase, we would pronounce it Powhatan around here. So what is around here? Well, Jamestown, this is a map of Eastern Virginia. We cut off two-thirds of our state. We're going to focus on this part of Virginia. This right here is an island on the James River, and this is where Jamestown is. I'm speaking to you right here in a town called West Point, but it's in this section of the state. You see, the Powhatan people came from this section of what we now call Virginia. This is the red dashed line on this modern map to mark the areas north and east of this line is where the Powhatan Native American people lived. We call it the Tidewater of Virginia. You'll hear it called the coastal plain. Excuse me, the coastal plain. Basically, in Maryland, it's not that different than Eastern Maryland, right? It's very similar. The land is flat. There's lots of water. In fact, our two states really have so much in common geographically and historically. So, both of our states are shaped by the Chesapeake Bay. The culture is very similar. But this pink area of the map next to this line, think of it as anything north of Interstate 64 and anything east of Interstate 95. And that would have been land that Powhatan people referred to as Sinacomica. That's Algonquin. That's their language. And it means the crowded country, essentially. And I'll show you a slide that will point that out. But just to paint a picture for you, the land is very flat. There's lots of water, lots of rivers, right? And again, sometimes I do this for people much farther away, so they're not familiar with the geography. It's not different than where you live. But the point is, the Powhatan were also more than one tribe. We'll get into that. They were a collection of nations, but they were shaped by the Chesapeake Bay and these four major rivers, Potomac, Rappahannock, York, and James. Now, these two names, York and James, were English name changes. So this was originally the Pamunkey River, and this was originally the Powhatan River. But the point is, one big bay, an ocean, and four rivers, and flat land, lots of forest, which means the Powhatan live off fishing, the Powhatan live off hunting, and the Powhatan live off farming corn, beans, squash, pumpkins, succotash, and they eat wild turkey and deer. So one way to remember Native American food is if it's something people hunt, it's probably Native American. If it's something people farm, it's probably brought from Europe. That's one way to think of animals in this country. Now, the food you eat at Thanksgiving is very much based on Native American cuisine. And of course, the Powhatan used these resources for not just food, but for clothing. This is a drawing that shows you how they would have dressed in the summertime. And I'll get younger people who will say, well, they're not wearing a lot of clothing. And I was like, well, the reason you're wearing a lot of clothing today is cultural. But number two, you can go to a store, even if you're not very rich, and you can get clothing because it's made so cheaply, you see. But if you all and I had to hunt deer every time we wanted a piece of clothing, we certainly would have a lot less of it. And also keep in mind this is the summertime clothing, wearing the deer skin, whereas in the wintertime, one would leave the fur on for warmth. And there's another thing that the Powhatan did. They would take hunted bear and melt down their fat, kind of like Vicks Vapor Rub, and they would rub it on their bodies, and it would actually keep them warm. So they've been living here for a long time. The earliest evidence of Native Americans in Virginia is about 12,000 years ago. But the Powhatan as a group probably, and I say probably, emerged around the 1200s based on recent archaeology. All right, now, so the word Powhatan itself is also an Algonquin word. It means waterfalls or river falls. And it originally was the name of just one Native American town, which just happens to be called Richmond today. So if you go to Richmond, you'll notice under the interstate these big boulders, these big rocks, and you'll see these rapids. So that's actually where the Powhatan word comes from, their word for that place. Richmond was renamed for a neighborhood in London. So, Mark, if these names keep changing from Powhatan to English, that's probably telling us who's ultimately going to win the war, when they have war. Yes. But they started out as six nations that banded together for, well, defense, for alliance, for trade. They were all, I like to call the original six tribes blood tribes. They're related. They're the original, true six Powhatan tribes. And then very quickly, not too long before Jamestown, they grew from six tribes to 30. Now, I'm going to argue no matter what culture you're talking about, that's probably not done nicely. And I think there's a lot of myth making about Native Americans, and I'm not here to disparage them. I'm here to say that, 50, 60 years ago, if you watch Hollywood and you think about what the tours were like, you probably would have had someone talking to you about the English came from Europe and civilized the Powhatan, who were very primitive. That would have been the point of view you got in Hollywood. That would have been the point of view you got in university not that long ago. All right. Now we've gone past that, thankfully. But it got replaced by something I think equally offensive, which is a bunch of people thinking that the Powhatan were magical and they just did yoga in the forest and they were just completely innocent. No, the Powhatan people, like any other nation, had criminals that they punished. They had leaders. They had taxes. They had wars. All people to me are very similar, basically. There's good and bad in anyone. No, my argument in favor of the Powhatan is not that they're more moral or less moral than the English. I actually think that's irrelevant. It's that they're already here. So anybody logically would defend their country if they felt someone else was going to take it from them. See, if I was a lawyer, that would be the argument I would make, not trying to make them into little children, because I think that makes the Powhatan look weak when I don't think they really were. So, where am I going with this? We now know that the other 24 tribes were conquered. We call them tributary tribes. They actually had to pay 80% of their corn as a tax to the head chief, who then would give them some of the corn back to survive. But that was a way of maintaining power and control. And if you were late or didn't pay, we'll talk about who he is, would send warriors to wipe you out. And this happened in a few cases. So, who is this person we're talking about? Well, the name of the original tribe is the Powhatan. Then they grew to be six tribes. And then they grew to be 30 tribes in a land they called Sinacomico. And then each tribe had their own chief. And then they all had a head chief. That's not weird. We have 50 states. We have 50 governors. We have one federal government and we have one president, right? So each state has their own system in a federal government. And then we have a national federal government we all pay taxes to that's in charge of us all. Well, yeah, that's not that different than the Powhatan. So they called their local governor chiefs werawances. Again, you don't have to remember all these words. And they called their head chief or president or king a Mamanatoic, which is sort of means the chief of chiefs. And this guy's name, and he's going to be very important today, Wahun Sunakok. That's his actual name. We'll go by his nickname, Chief Powhatan. He is the father of Pocahontas. And in the time period where the English show up, he's 60 years old, much older than the now, right? And he has outlived his enemies. He's outlived his friends. He's conquered 24 tribes. So why am I telling you all this? Because he's not going to be scared of the English. And that's something Hollywood doesn't get. I keep talking about Hollywood. Trust me, I'll bash them in just a minute because there has been a few movies about Jamestown, and they perpetuate myths that make kind of my job harder. But we'll go back to them in a second. I want to also set up who the English were because I think the English are often falsely stereotyped in movies in America just as much as Native Americans are. If the problem with Hollywood is making Native Americans look primitive, then the problem with Hollywood about the English is making them all look rich and snooty, which is also wrong. Because, sure, there are rich people in England, there always have been. But if you watch enough films, you'd think they're all living in castles or manor houses, but that's just not the case. So England is a very wealthy country today, but they weren't really 400 years ago. Oh no, England is what I call on the screen a second-rate European power. I didn't say third rate. I didn't say fourth rate. But I'm saying they're not as wealthy as France. And they certainly don't have colonies yet, like Portugal and Spain. Just as a reminder, 110 years before Jamestown is Christopher Columbus. And in 1494, the Pope divided the world in half and said the East is Portugal, the West is Spanish, and nobody else had a say. And in that time period, what are these two nations doing? Going all over the world, and they're getting money through spices, through gold, through silver. They're getting enormous wealth. And that's really the purpose of a colony. Now, I'm not trying to be politically correct here, but I don't think there's really technically a nice colony because when you think about what a colony really is, I can give you the book answer, but I don't like book answers. I think book answers are get in the way. Breaking it down in normal people language, a colony is a way for a country to make money taking away another country's resources. Every one of them does that. You see, so you can't start a colony unless you don't have problems at home. England's a second rate power. It's not often known, but 9 times before Jamestown, they tried to start an American colony, and they're 0-9 in 1607. You may have heard of the lost colony of Roanoke in North Carolina. That's just one failure of 9 failures. These failures are expensive. Think about the early days of the space race. Think back, and it's one of my interests. Think back to the early 1960s, late 1950s. I mean, we all know who got the head start. It was the Soviet Union. And how embarrassing it was for the United States to be failing at first. Now, ultimately, it's going to be the other way around. And I think we see a similar thing with the English. They are jealous of Spain. They are behind the times with Spain. They're 0-9. The sun hasn't risen on the British Empire. But 98% of their people were poor. I don't think a lot of Americans know that basically 600 families called the nobility own the whole country. Even to this day, very few English people own their own land. This is much more of an American thing. See, the average English person honestly was a poor farmer who didn't own their land. Think about a term we use today. You had to pay rent to the lord of the land, and we, of course, use the term landlord from this original meaning. So, You have these rich families that are landed gentry and noblemen. You have the royal family, and you have some wealthy businessmen in London. But other than that, everybody else is either a poor farmer or someone living in the slums of London, you see. So there's a second reason you start a colony. See, the first reason is to do what? To make money, right? The second reason is to get rid of people you don't want. And see, unless you're 100% Native American, whether your family was forced to come here or came here willingly, and I say this very loudly, but also very proudly, unless you're 100% Native American, you are related to another country that did not want your family, and that's why you're here. It's what we all have in common. Some a little farther back than others, but ultimately it's the same reasons. You see, England's economy was in the tank 400 years ago. They had a wool market that was failing. They had farms that were going under. There were poor people who couldn't afford the rent on the farms. It reminds me of the Dust Bowl during the Great Depression. My own grandfather lost a family farm and like so many others, had to find work. Okay, I remember this in my own family, and I'm thinking this is probably what it was like in the 1600s. Usually it's the young people in the family, and they want to have opportunities, so they pack up their belongings and they take to the road and they try to find a job in the big bad city. And there are a few cities in England, but none bigger than London that's depicted here on the screen. London is exploding in population. London is now 250,000 people, but there's not enough houses. And London is a nice place when you're rich, but it's a terrible place to be poor. You'll have people try to tell you about good old days. And we always remember the good old days when we were children because we didn't have to pay bills, you see. But the reality is when you read the news of any time period, as an historian, you'll find it's almost always the same problems. Poverty, crime. What was crime like in London? Well, I looked this up. The murder rate in 1607 was 10 times higher than it is today. There were gang violence. It's different than now, but still, they had that. They had an opioid crisis, but it's laudanum. They had a pandemic. It's called the plague. And I actually once read this book that's hilarious. It's called The Dictionary of the Vulgar English Tongue, basically slang. And it was written in 1603, and it was done by letter. And I got to the letter E, and I saw 27 different phrases from the 1600s. I had to mug someone in the streets of London. And that was enough to tell me, oh, it isn't all that different. See, so what can a colony do? It can solve that resource problem. It can solve that national pride problem. But on the other hand, it's also a nice way to get rid of the fact you have too many people. And that's what Jamestown's going to do. It's going to be the first settlement of a colony called Virginia. Now, Virginia has existed on a map in English mind for nearly 100 years. What they meant by Virginia would have been everything from New York City to South Carolina, but they kind of don't know how big it is. That's Virginia to them. And they want to start, what we would call a beachhead. They need to get a settlement to get started. But I should remind you also what's very similar with the space program of the years past and today is that it's extremely expensive. Crossing an ocean was a very expensive thing 400 years ago because it requires ships and sailors and guns and supplies and food. You got to bring all that with you, just like if you were to go to the moon. You got to bring it all with you. And that's going to cost a lot of money. Yeah, and someone's going to pay. Oh, don't ask this guy. Not this guy. Who is this guy? Well, you see a map of England, which has already conquered Wales. So no offense to the Welsh, but Wales at this point in time is officially part of England. The separate country of Scotland in red and Ireland in blue. And this, my friends, is King James. Of course, everything's named for King James. King James is the same king for the King James Bible. King James is the same king during Jamestown. So he's very important because a lot of things is named for him. And look at him. Now you can go on Google and look for other pictures of King James, and I'll wait for you because you're not going to find one where he doesn't look incredibly annoyed. That's a window into his personality. I actually like King James, but he's not very well respected among British historians. I think Americans like him better. You see, the thing about King James is he's not even English. He's originally King James the Sixth of Scotland. Now, how does he get to be the King of England? Well, Elizabeth the First, perhaps the greatest ruler in English history, her and Churchill would be my two votes. Oh, well, she dies in 1603, 4 years before Jamestown, and has no children and no surviving sibling. So that's a problem. It's a gigantic problem. Somebody's got to run the country, right? Well, of course, you can find one of her cousins. And to be honest, every European king and queen's a cousin. So that's not that hard. And James is her cousin. But most importantly, you need to be a Protestant. And that rules out a lot of people. So the King of Scotland, James the Sixth, is invited to be King James the First of England. And certainly he's going to say, well, sure. But he also claims that he's also King James the First of Ireland. They're not united kingdoms yet. There are three separate kingdoms with three separate versions of Christianity: Presbyterians in Scotland, Church of England in England, Catholics in Ireland. Okay, now my point is you have one king for three kingdoms, three religions, and one official church. And if you look at this map and say, that's a disaster waiting to happen, you'd be right. But this guy, to be fair, is very good at kind of handling all these differences. Except he's got a problem with what he considers radical Puritans and Presbyterians in this area here, Scotland and England borders. He says these people are troublemakers. They're too religious. They're not supporting me as the head of the Church of England. So what we're going to do, we're going to round them up and send them to Ireland to deal with our Catholic problem, you see, quote unquote. And of course, that began at the time of Jamestown. And the violence in Northern Ireland did not end until 1998. I think it's actually very important to study the 1600s to understand today. You certainly can't understand Northern Ireland without understanding King James. And how are you going to understand the United States without understanding King James? These two things were going on at the same time. In other words, the English might view the Native Americans exactly like they view the Irish, which, by the way, isn't good. Okay, back to our story. James is also incredibly cheap. He doesn't have a lot of money. He is Scottish, so he won't even want to spend any of it. And he has to sign off on any colony. Now, he's not paying for any of this, and he won't pay for any of this. So someone has to pay. And who has to pay? The Virginia Company of London. Don't have that slide. The Virginia Company of London, and I'll try to do this quickly, is officially known as a joint stock company, which is just an old-fashioned way to say corporation. So what we're seeing here is a group of London businessmen who were already wealthy, who would like to be wealthier, which is not surprising. And these men call themselves the Virginia Company of London and call themselves gentlemen adventurers. The funny thing is, these guys aren't actually going to leave the country, yet they call themselves adventurers. But if you listen carefully, we use a term today: venture capitalist, and then you got it. See, capitalism is being born in this time period. So what the Virginia Company is going to do is they're made up of rich guys that are going to invest their money into buying the supplies, ships, guns, and stuff they need. They're not going to go to Virginia themselves. They're going to recruit desperate people to do that for them. And then they need the permission of the king. So the Virginia Company of London today would kind of be SpaceX. See, space travel is increasingly privatized in the modern world. That's just a fact of what it's going to be in the next 100 years. I won't live to see it all, but I know that's what's going to happen because this is what we're doing, is repeating this history. You see, I'm not against it. I think they do great work. But the thing is, when somebody gets on the news and says, yeah, we're going to fly to Mars and it's going to be easy, I'm like, oh, no, no, you got to learn your history. It's never going to be easy. So the Virginia Company is SpaceX, and they need permission from the king. And the king gets lawyers involved, and they write what's called a charter or a contract. You might even call it a permission slip. And it's written in 400-year-old Shakespearean English, so I'll just spare you that and say, I'm James, ruler of three countries. I'm James, the head of the church. I will let you go to Virginia. And I will let you have the rights of English people when you get here. All nice stuff. But you got to read the fine print. I like to call it the fine cursive. It says if you go to Virginia and you die, it is not the king's fault. If you go to Virginia and you lose your money, you may not sue the king. If you go to Virginia and you start a war with the Spanish, well, I'm not helping you and you're on your own. If anything goes wrong, it is not my fault. Today in politics, this is called plausible deniability because he actually does know what's going on, but on paper, you can't blame me. Oh, and if you are successful and you do find gold and silver, the king gets 20% of the money just for signing his name. Now, this is something that has not even taken place in Virginia yet. And why did we bother telling you this? Because you need to know this to understand that these decisions in England will end up getting people killed. Because the charter also says you can take any land not possessed by a Christian prince. In other words, whoever's living there already, it doesn't matter if they live there already. And so this is almost predicting there will be violence. All right. So they rounded up, I want to go faster here. They rounded up 105 men and boys. Now there's 4 million people in England, and a lot of them are poor, and only 105 sign up for this. Well, yeah, because most people think this is a bad idea. About half the colonists are working class, carpenters, blacksmiths, tradesmen. We would say contractors today. Think about those guys. And then the other half are actually gentlemen. And it might sound like I'm about to contradict myself, but you have to understand in England, if you're not the oldest son of a wealthy family, you won't be inheriting any land or any money. You might inherit an attitude, but you won't have any money. So you're going to have to make your own fortune. And a lot of these gentlemen had also been military men. So they're thinking, well, the gentlemen are from well-born families. They have leadership experience. They've been to war before. But you'll notice I didn't say they brought any women because they didn't recruit any women the first year. Oh, I think they don't want to risk their lives, you see. Yeah, well, that will also be a mistake. Now, 4 of them are teenage boys. So 105 guys, 4 are teenagers. Not super young, 13, 14, 15. All right, now let's give you what it looks like today. They got on these 3 ships and they crossed the ocean. And for most people, that's the story. They got on 3 ships, they crossed the ocean, they sang songs, and they drank beer and had a good time. No. 3.5 months of being stuck in a slow-moving sailing ship. Because it takes 11 hours in an airplane to get from Virginia to England, and we think that's too long. 3.5 months of hearing the same dumb jokes, 3.5 months of eating the same bad food, 3.5 months of seasickness, 3.5 months of overcrowding. I think the best thing I could tell you is if you want to know what that was like, spend 3.5 months in a New York City subway car and get back to me, and you'll get the idea. All right. Now they landed in April of 1607. I'll show you where. They actually landed right here and what we now call Virginia Beach. They named it Cape Henry for the prince. Now, when they landed, they opened up a secret document, a letter written by the Virginia Company. You're not allowed to open it until you land. So they opened it up, and it said there's 4 rules you have to follow. The first rule is don't stay next to the ocean. You'll be killed by the Spanish. The Spanish consider Virginia to be part of Florida, so that's legitimately a good point. So they end up sailing 40 miles west of the Atlantic Ocean. The second rule they have to follow is to find a deep river. Let's go ahead and show you some video. This is actually from Jamestown Island looking to the east. So the ocean is 40 miles in the distance. And this is actually the one picture I can show you that probably looks the most like 400 years ago. They're actually seeing this view. Now, the second rule is to find a deep river channel. This is very, very important because the last thing you want a ship to do is crash in shallow water. And the nice thing about the James River is it's not very shallow. Well, it is right next to the shoreline, but right here in the middle, here, you can actually see a little bit of a break in the color, a little line here. That's actually The strong, fast-moving current of the James River Channel. It's 36 feet deep right there. This is good because the English are good at sailing. This is not a problem for them. They're like, okay, we got a deep river. That's wonderful. We got ourselves a place to hide from the Spanish. That's great. What's the third rule, Mark? The third rule is to find the high ground so you can build a fort. Now, didn't I tell you earlier we're in the flat tidewater coastal plain of Virginia and you're supposed to look for high ground? Now, you're looking around here and you're saying, well, doesn't look like very high ground to me. Well, because they're not looking for Denver, Colorado here. We're not talking about high ground like the Rockies. We're talking about a big enough hill where you could build a fort to give you a huge advantage in battle. And I got one for you right here on the right-hand side. This is a hill right here that's 14 feet tall. By the way, that's a ferry boat taking cars across using the exact part of the river the English used to use. So we still use that river today. All right, now this is great. You got a big hill. You have a deep river, and you're hiding from the Spanish. Yeah, there's a fourth rule. I do tours with people from Virginia. Actually, they're the hardest people to teach because they, oh, I know everything already. There will be people who will tell you, well, we got deeper rivers in Virginia. We do. We have farther places from the ocean than Jamestown. We do. We have higher ground in Virginia than Jamestown. We do. But then you'll hear people say, then they're dumb for picking that place. It's one more rule. Fourth rule. You may not settle where you see the naturals, Native Americans. Don't offend them. Just find a place where you don't see any of them. So remember, they've been at sea for quite a while, and they took another 3 weeks slowly moving up the river to find the perfect place. And they see this place with a big hill, with a deep river, far enough from the ocean, and they don't see any Native American people there. And it's now May 15th, 1607, the day they choose to land. Oh, makes sense. But then you have to ask yourself, does this look too good to be true? If this place is so wonderful, would somebody already be living there? Wouldn't you be a little bit suspicious? I would be until you realize. But if we were at sea for 3.5 months, if we're looking to better our lives, if we had all these rules to follow and we're just done with the voyage, and if this place checks all four boxes, I think that's good enough. So they're going to roll these big barrels up the hill. They're going to carry these big crates up the hill and stack them. They're going to be chopping down trees. They're going to be hammering tent pegs. And they're going to be watched the whole time. The Powhatan people are close by. There were 30 tribes. One was across the river, Koyakahannock. One was 4 miles to the west on their side of the river, called Paspahegh. So remember how I told you the movies get Jamestown wrong? Here's how they get it wrong. There's a movie called The New World. It was 21 years ago. It's not that recent anymore. But they do the same thing that Hollywood always does. The English come up the river, the scary dramatic music, and they always show the Powhatan, terrified, thinking the English are gods from outer space. Honestly, that's garbage. I don't want to get too bogged down here, but the Powhatan had seen Europeans many times for the last 80 years. We actually know the Spanish explored that area at least 6 times. There was a couple times there was violence. Sometimes Europeans would be lost and then they would go home, and sometimes they would trade and go home. But see, I don't think any culture cares if you show up, trade, and go home any more than you would care if I knocked on your door and tried to sell you something. Either you say go away or you say, what are you selling? It's not a crime. No, what's different is these guys are chopping down trees and putting up tents. That doesn't look like they're going away. It'd be like you coming home today, finding me camped out in your backyard for the last 3 weeks, and then I ate all the food out of your house. I have a feeling that would be a crime. But they don't think the English are gods. I've heard this a lot. That's not what they called them. They called them Tesanas, which in Algonquin means foreigners, people from somewhere else. We've seen you before. Oh, it's you guys again. Which tribe are you? The English tribe? I think this picture is going to tell you what happens next. Anyway, the English settled on the Paspahegh land. Remember again, the Paspahegh are one of 30 Powhatan tribes. They just happen to be the one whose land Jamestown's on. And I have to mention this guy, Winchipunk. He's one of those local chiefs. We know from written English history and Powhatan oral history. So there are Powhatan descendants today. I look at both, and they both agree that both groups had some sort of sit down or meeting around a campfire on May 16th, 1607. People laugh at this, but I want to tell you something. You got a bunch of young warriors and young soldiers. You know how 22-year-old guys are. Now you give them a bunch of weapons, and now they're staring at each other around a campfire very suspiciously. All it takes is one person to pop off, and what happens? I would think that would be a very scary situation. So Winchipunk is supposedly the guy who got up and spoke as the local chief, and he said, "Look, we've watched you come up this river. You settled on our hunting grounds. We don't live here, we live up the river, but this is where we hunt. You're going to take food from our people. You chop down our trees. You didn't ask our permission. You didn't bring us any gifts. These are all insults, you know? And we want you to leave. So leave." And he was very clear about this. Oh, right, in Algonquin. See, the Powhatan version of the story is their chief was very clear. The English version of the story is we don't know what the man is saying. We don't know why they left upset. We're shrugging our shoulders. I wonder what they wanted. It's important to know that when you can't speak the same language, you might have a lot of trouble communicating your desires and wants and needs. Except, I'm not so sure that's the best explanation. I don't think the English are stupid because I'm sure they can read the body language. I'm sure we can read the body language of people we offend who don't speak our language. I think if someone starts screaming at you in a foreign language and waving their fist, I think you would know enough to say, that person doesn't like me or want me here. So I don't think that's the best explanation. I think more than likely the English just aren't worried about the Powhatan. I mean, they're carrying bows and arrows, they're wearing deerskin. The English write about how they view the primitive Powhatan people. They see them that way. I don't agree with that. I'm just saying that's what they wrote. They're not in a hurry to build a fort. In fact, even after this awkward meeting, they don't even build the fort. Is this heading to something? 12 days later, right here, this is a swamp, by the way, 6 inches deep, the water, tall grass. The trees you're looking at are very recent. You would need to think about trees 3 times taller. And I'm going to show you a road that still exists today. It's a gravel road we use to get construction vehicles on the site. But you may not realize it yet, and most people don't when they visit. That road right there existed 400 years ago. It's one of the oldest roads in this country. Now, you have to, in your mind, take away this fort. Just keep them on this big hill here. It's big hill, 100 English guys, and right here on this road, 12 days later, 400 Powhatan warriors. That's about 8 tribes worth of warriors. It means Winchipunk kind of did the Paul Revere thing and went to the other chiefs for help. Now, I've done tours for active duty military groups. It's a very big honor to do that, but I want to help out. So I once had the 82nd Airborne on a tour. And these are young guys. They're all like 6'6", by the way. I'm not going to waste their time talking about butter churning. I'm not going to waste their time looking at statues. I don't think that's relevant information for these people. Certainly, they don't fight with the same weapons as 400 years ago. But why do we do military history? Because tactics and leadership haven't really changed. It's very, very simple. If you outnumber somebody 400 to 100, you have an advantage. If you're on your own land and the other people are new to that land, you have an advantage. Just because someone has better technology and better weapons does not guarantee them victory. When you underestimate people, and some of you have lived through it, you know what I'm talking about. When you underestimate local people's ability to fight, you're going to find out the hard way. And I think this is why we teach soldiers. So right here, where I'm walking, 400 warriors in a crescent formation shoot at the English with their bows and arrows. Now, again, no fort yet, okay? Remember, it's not there. The English take matchlock muskets. They seem like antiques. Sometimes we have to remember that they have a high caliber bullet, very, very large bullet. Now, they're not very accurate, but if you bunch your fire and you hit something, it's going to do a lot of damage. The English guns are very powerful, and they drove off the Powhatan warriors with one shot. And you know what they're doing, right? Like, yes, look how easy that was. Here's the problem. To reload an English musket took 30 to 40 seconds. A Powhatan warrior can shoot 8 arrows per minute. So they have 4 times as many people and shoot 4 times faster. That's almost a 64 by to 1 firepower advantage. Telling me who's got the advantage. What ends up actually happening is within 20 minutes, the Powhatan are completely on top of the English, firing their arrows into the tents, wounding many of the English people who begin to panic, drop their weapons, and run to the river. Run to the river? Where are they going to run to? Well, where? This is the river back here. There's nowhere to go. They're surrounded. They're about to be wiped out. Think of this battle as the English being the heavyweight champion that you put your money on, and all of a sudden they're on the ropes about to be knocked out. The real reason that they ran to the shore to wave and yell and scream is to get the attention of sailors on the ships. The sailors used their cannons. For some reason I got stuck here. The sailors used their cannons. I'm going to get this program back up, don't worry. The sailors used their cannons and fired them at the Powhatan. And I will tell you something. They told you what they used. They used small shot. And when you use small shot, they actually, let's get issues here. Sorry about that, guys. I had a issue with the PowerPoint. We'll fix it. I keep talking. So the issue here, besides my computer, is that the English use small shot. What small shot means is golf ball size cannonballs. Golf ball size cannonballs like a giant shotgun that devastates the Powhatan warriors. Absolutely. And it causes them to panic. And when the Powhatan panic, well, the Powhatan start to run and the English aren't done with them. The English aren't done with them. The English are going to actually use bar shot. Bar shot looks like aerobics weights. And you fire them out of the cannon and you fire them at trees. And when you fire them at trees, they blow up the trees. And when they blow up the trees, the tree branches come down on the Powhatan, and it is devastating to the Powhatan. So that's gonna be a problem. And I'm going to tell you something. The English are gonna win that battle. 40 dead Powhatan warriors. Only 2 English have died. And I think it's a tragedy for everyone. See, I'm not using this story to celebrate violence. In fact, I don't like violence, but I'm also not going to ignore violence. You see, the thing about the Powhatan and the English is when the battle is over, there are three very important lessons that both sides can learn. Lesson number one is that the Powhatan will prove to the English that they can and they will resist them. Lesson number two is that the Powhatan learn the hard way what English technology can do to them. And lesson number three, well, the English are encouraged to build a fort, and they build their fort very quickly. They told us that they built a triangle-shaped fort. They told us they built this triangle-shaped fort in 19 days with half-moon bulwarks. Now, there's lessons, and I think these lessons are very important because they're lessons in the world today. If you look at the 400-year-old history of the British Empire, what do we learn? Local people have the ability to resist the English. If we look at that story in Assandawana, South Africa in 1879, or Khartoum, Sudan, or we learn this story in Ireland, or we learn it at Bunker Hill, there is this holiday that's being celebrated in the world every 3 to 4 days. Independence from the British Empire. But the flip side of that is, if you look at the 400-year-old history of the British Empire, when they really want something, they're hard to get rid of. See, I don't think either side celebrated the violence. I think they didn't expect it to happen. And when it happened, well, then this is going to make the story much, much more difficult. By the way, this is a picture of some bar shot. Sorry for the delay. I'm going to give you a version of my program that's less clunky. One of the two English people who died was actually not a soldier. It was a teenage boy. We've been doing archaeology since 1994. When we actually dug up a grave with legal permission in 2003, we found the skeleton of a European, this is the temples and teeth pattern of a European male, based on the forehead, the bone structure, based on the teeth, 15-year-old. And it's blurry, but that's a Native American arrowhead and a shoulder broken by a Powhatan war club. This is real. This is reality. Every single battle that's ever happened has had innocent people die. I'm going to do 5 more minutes. Any story that's a battle ends like this. The English said they built a triangle-shaped fort with half-moon bulwarks in 19 days. This is a map of that fort that shows a triangle-shaped fort with half-moon bulwarks. A lot of people tell me that it's way too quick to build a fort in 19 days. Well, number one, fear is what's going to get you to build a fort quickly. Number two, sailors were there for 6 weeks to help you build that fort. We didn't know about the fort, though, when I was a kid. We were told that the fort rotted away, and the fort did rot away in the 1630s. We were told that 100 yards of land was missing from the James Fort because of river sea level rise. That's very true. 100 yards of our island is underwater now that used to not be. So when I was a kid, we came to the park, we looked at statues, we had tour guides, and they all told us that everything was underwater, making the tour terrible. But in 1994, archaeologists began finding artifacts. Not rich people stuff, tobacco pipes, basically cigarette butts, beer bottles, pieces of armor and guns and ceramics, what soldiers would have. They began to dig deeper and find these trenches that were dug to put poles in the ground. It's called a post hole. They found these dark stains where the wood used to be. They found the artifacts proving who did it. And they actually found and have been able to reconstruct the Jamestown fort. We know what the fort looked like. It had 14-foot tall walls. It had 12 cannons that could shoot 2,000 yards each. It had guns placed at the river in case the Spanish came or the Powhatan came by canoe. They had guns placed to the north in case the Powhatan came by foot. When you read about Jamestown, And you hear about all the problems of Jamestown. It's a great fort from an army point of view, but it's a terrible place to live. The English lost one guy in the voyage. They lost two people in the battle. They lost 10 more people before the fort was finished. The Powhatan ambushed them. They had 92 people when the fort was finished, and those 92 are now very well protected. And the Powhatan decide that they can't attack the fort without losing all of their people. So they're willing to sit back and let the English kill themselves off because the fatal flaw of Jamestown is it's a great place for a fort, but there's no fresh water. You need water and food to keep an army in the field. Jamestown has a swamp full of arsenic and a river full of salt and no other source of water above ground. They thought they didn't need it because they brought beer with them to drink, but they ran out of the beer. And then they start to drink water from the river and they get sick. Then they dig wells like this one that we found 15 years ago. Even digging a well for fresh water is a problem when you dig it in sandy soil. And the river water gets into it, which has got salt in it. And the salt water gets into it, which has got arsenic. And the human and animal waste gets E. coli bacteria into the water supply. Jamestown was a failure for the first couple years. They couldn't find any gold and silver. The Virginia Company makes terrible decisions across the ocean. The leaders, the first two, fail. The Powhatan want the English dead. Men are dying on a daily basis. We'll do one more thing. So what does Jamestown finally get a little bit successful? When they get their third commander, Captain John Smith, 27 years old, redhead, from Lincolnshire, England. That's in the East Midlands of England. It's a very rural part of England. It's sort of like Arkansas is to the United States. He's a soldier. He's been to war 3 times. He likes to quote the Bible. He can't stand gentlemen or rich people. He's a good old boy. He takes command of Jamestown when it's at its worst. He takes command and builds houses for the soldiers to live in that we're finding and rebuilding. He hated the gentlemen for refusing to work with their hands, so he locked the door of the storehouse and declared, "He that will not work shall not eat," which is a quote from the Bible. And he realized the Virginia Company wouldn't bring the food in time, and he realized gentlemen won't grow it. He knew that Londoners couldn't farm, so he decided to trade with the Powhatan. And on one of his trade missions, he went out with a Native American tour guide who he didn't realize was taking him into a trap 20 miles from Jamestown. He got surrounded by 200 warriors and taken prisoner. They took him over the next 60 days to eventually a place known as Waramacomico, the Powhatan capital, where he was sat on the floor of a big house, saw Chief Powhatan at the age of 60, wearing eagle feathers, copper, pearls, and sitting on a throne with his wives and children. He was meeting a king. He will claim in his book that he tried to outsmart the king, that he could charm the king. But then we were told the warriors grabbed him and threw him to the ground and were about to murder him until 10-year-old Pocahontas saved his life. Well, we're supposed to believe a 10-year-old girl threw off warriors like an NFL defensive end. We're supposed to believe that she dived in slow motion to fall in love with John Smith at first sight and beg for his life. But more than likely, the whole thing was a ritual. It's like my favorite movie. Chief Powhatan is going to make John Smith an offer he can't refuse. I can kill you when I want. I can save you when I want. I'm a king and you're a nobody. And now let's do business. It leads to a period of trade and peace. The English will provide the Powhatan with metal tools, blue beads. The English will get food in return to keep them alive. And both sides will trade teenage boys to learn the other's language and be able to communicate. It's a nice place to stop right now. I want you to know that it won't be a happy ending. It works, until the Virginia company says, we don't want you to trade with the Powhatan. Burn them out. We have so much more to cover. There's other lessons to do. But I do want you to see how peace was possible. Language, trade, good trade prevents war, communication, good leadership. But if you have bad leadership and bad communication and bad trade, you're going to start a war. So Jamestown's worst years are still ahead of it. But from this moment in time, the English have their piece of America and they're going to grow it. But I didn't say it was all done nicely. Okay. You've been very patient with me, and I do apologize for the little internet snafu, but what are you going to do? And I want to stop right here talking and let you have a chance to catch your breath. And if you have anything you want to share with me, that's fine as well. But I want to make sure the formal part of the presentation is ended.
If anyone has a question, feel free to drop it in the chat or unmute yourself, which might be the fastest. So, anybody?
I'm extremely impressed. I visited Jamestown almost 50 years ago, and I'm so impressed at all the advances you've had. Um, Thank you very much for doing this.
Well, I appreciate you. Yes, it's changed a lot. It's even changed a lot in the last 10, 15 years. It makes my job exciting because you're thinking, well, how could you get excited spending 14 years telling the same story? It's because you're never done. There's always new things we're learning, and I get to write my own stuff and change my mind based on evidence. And ironically, I came to Jamestown looking for the past. And what I've really uncovered is so much of the present, business, politics. I don't care how you vote. I'm saying your side existed back then. And you look at all the conflicts in the world today, you'll find some similarities and you'll see the way business operates, the way space travel operates. There are a lot of things about the 17th century that shape our modern world. And in many ways, we're still living in it. And I think it's finally how I've appreciated Jamestown.
Were the Powhatan people primarily located on the western shore of the Chesapeake, or were they
Uh,
also on the eastern shore?
Thank you. I forgot to mention they're also on the Eastern Shore. We Wicomico, the Accomack, and there's two other tribes. Those tribes tended to have more of a hostile relationship with Chief Powhatan. They had resented the taxes. They were somewhat isolated. And during some of the darkest moments where the Powhatan were winning wars against the English could always rely on help from some of those tribes. The Powhatan, in the end, turned out to be no more united than what happened to the Aztecs. Just like when I'm attacking England, back then I would get the Scots or the Irish to help. You always find the weak part, and it's usually your neighbors. So, race, culture aside, anytime you're invading someone, you want to find which neighbor of theirs is going to be helping you. And it's a good tactic. And so, yeah, the Eastern Shore is technically in the Powhatan world, but generally speaking, much more willing to be independent and help the English for their own political and economic reasons. I find Powhatan politics very sophisticated. If we get past the technology gap, you'll find the mindset of the rulers is very, very similar to anyone else.
Would that include the lower eastern shore of Maryland?
Yeah, they're kind of cousins. So the Nanticoke, for example, uh, related to the Lenape, the Doeg, all those nations, they were able to communicate with the Powhatan. They would speak enough of a similar language and culturally. Smith does end up exploring, of course, what's now Maryland. He goes as far as Aberdeen. No, sorry, Head of Elk. He gets that far up. So he recognizes and wrote that they had a similar language. I know some Nanticoke personally, and so it's kind of like they're similar enough, but I imagine if the Powhatan were to sail to Scandinavia, well, what's the difference between a Dane and a Swede and a Norwegian? Well, to the Norwegians and Danes, there's a lot of difference. From the outside, they're similar. So it's just that the Powhatan nation, for those that Powhatan had conquered, and there's sort of natural barriers. The fall line of the rivers, the Potomac is a border, and the Chesapeake Bay is a border. So if you think about it, the borders of Virginia are the Powhatan borders. The English simply took them over. Um, and so, yeah, we can get into Virginia, Maryland issue too. It's great because when we get into later, Jamestown, Maryland, Virginia, of course, go to war over Kent Island, and but yeah, for right now, they are related, uh, and communicate. They can communicate. The Powhatan could communicate with the Lenape of what's now New York City, New Jersey, better than they can communicate with Siouan speakers 30 miles to the west. So it tells us that the fall line is a linguistic and cultural border from New York down to North Carolina.
Well, you're definitely getting some love in the chat. Thank you, Deb.
Oh, sorry, I hadn't read it. Yeah,
No, no,
good.
she says she loved the
Thank you.
presentation. And again, I always like to also be sensitive of your time. I have a feeling that hint, hint, Opal members, we would love to invite you back to maybe perhaps continue the story or come at it from another angle. I'm hearing so much left unyet said.
Well, so
So
I'll tell you what, if you guys have a suggestion box and make some suggestions, mainly I got to keep it in the 1600s, but there are things I can do. The first African story, the story of the first representative government, the rise of tobacco, a thing called Bacon's Rebellion when Virginians fight Virginians. Um, and all of this, by the way, affects Maryland, 1634. So many Virginians did not like the Maryland colony. It's a Catholic colony. A lot of the Puritans were kicked out of Virginia, ended up in Maryland, aka Annapolis. And when you send a bunch of Puritans in a Catholic colony, you've just recreated Northern Ireland and the state borders of Maryland. And it shows us, well, we don't talk about it all the time, but it explains city rivalries. It explains how architecture is done. And, the good thing about Maryland is Virginia and Maryland are so similar. It's not like where is that? But when I talk to people from like Los Angeles, it's like I'm on another planet. This story is very similar to your story and plays out, of course, very similarly. And so we can do any number of things. And yeah, so just give me a list of suggestions. And when you email me, I'll say, oh, yeah, I can do this one. This is one I can do. It's fun for me anyway to create something new if you wanted me to do that too.
excellent. Yes, you have one more
Sure,
question.
yeah, that's fine.
Again, we have to leave in 3 minutes.
Yeah, same thing, but that's fine. One more is good.
Because I researched my relatives way back then, the indenture system was quite prominent.
So let me just, I have to
Yeah,
relay
yeah,
in case. So
sure.
he's done some research, the indentured servant,
So the indenture system.
oh, the indentured system is quite,
Yeah, that's coming. That's coming pretty soon. So this story kind of was the first sort of, think of it like D-Day. And when you have the beachhead, that's when the most people die. 4 years later, when Virginia starts to harvest tobacco, they look at that as their way to increase their population and get rid of their urban poor. Some of the people sent here were coerced. Some were children. Some were petty criminals, not like murderers, but stole bread or something, like Australia. And they sent a lot of people here for 5 to 7 year contracts. Africans are thrown into that too, de facto enslaved, not de jure. So that takes a while for the laws to right. One of the things that surprises people both on the right and left wings is when I talk about the first Africans, I talk about poor whites who are servants and enslaved Africans after were often allies for about 40, 50 years, and then laws were passed to separate them. It's a cruel system, and there's a lot of myths about it being less, not too bad. But a few people survived it and became wealthy. But the English were very cruel to their own poor. So imagine what that means in the colony for everyone else too. So I don't throw poor Europeans under the bus. I think some people do that. I think it's wrong, because I think a lot of people at Jamestown suffered no matter what their skin color. So I try to shoot for the middle there. But anyway, we can cover that too. And it's a good point you brought up.
well, thank you, Mark. We appreciate you, and I'm sure this is not the last time we'll see you
Oh,
again.
great. Well, I'm glad to
So
do this. Appreciate you all.
thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.